Welcome to Risk Assessment for Cultural Resources, Module 3 of MHT's presentations on integrating cultural resources with hazard mitigation planning. This module will provide information about how to identify hazards, how to conduct a survey to identify cultural resources vulnerable to those hazards, how to assess the vulnerability of the cultural resources, and how to identify the next steps that should be taken to protect vulnerable resources. After listening to this module, you should be able to make an informed decision about whether or not to hire a contractor to conduct this type of work or do the work in-house. And if you do hire a contractor, this module will help give you an overview of the hazard mitigation components of the work and suggest where during the survey process you should seek technical assistance from the Maryland Historical Trust. The planning process for developing a hazard mitigation plan for cultural resources mirrors that of developing a local hazard mitigation plan. This presentation will focus on identifying and surveying cultural resources in hazard areas and conducting the risk assessment. This presentation is meant as an introduction to hazard mitigation survey for cultural resources. This work should be done by consultants or in-house personnel who meet the qualifications set forth in the Standards for Architectural and Historical Investigations in Maryland and who are knowledgeable about natural hazards like an environmental planner, a hazard mitigation planner, or a certified floodplain manager. Both disciplines, cultural resources and hazard mitigation planning, are needed to conduct the hazard mitigation survey and risk assessment. This slide provides an outline of the necessary steps to complete a risk assessment for your cultural resources. We'll go over each step in more detail during the course of this presentation. Many students and professionals working in cultural resources and related fields may not be familiar with hazard mitigation planning. FEMA has many resources related to hazard mitigation, but two are of particular interest to this topic. The State Mitigation Planning Key Topics Bulletin on Risk Assessment, and Integrating Historic Property and Cultural Resources Considerations in Hazard Mitigation Planning, which is Volume 6 in the State and Local Mitigation Planning How-To Guide. Although it is not specific to cultural resources and the audience is state employees, the Bulletin on Risk Assessment is a good primer on the steps involved in conducting a risk assessment. It is a short document, and I recommend that you read it before delving into the how-to guide and possibly before you watch the rest of this training video. The how-to guide is essential reading for understanding how cultural resources can and should be integrated into state and local hazard mitigation plans, projects, and planning efforts. I mention it every time I record a training module because it is the best thing we've got for doing this kind of work. It explains how to conduct a risk assessment for your cultural resources. This training is based on the how-to guide, but is specific to conducting risk assessments for Maryland's cultural resources. Perhaps you should give that a read too before you watch the rest of this video. Go ahead, I'll be here when you get back. Each county in the state, as well as the cities of Annapolis, Baltimore, and Ocean City, have local hazard mitigation plans. Local hazard mitigation plans are adopted through ordinance by the county and its local jurisdictions. The county's Office of Emergency Management, or Office of Public Safety, is usually in charge of updating the plan. The plan contains information on the types and locations of hazards that are found in the county, or the local jurisdictions. The plan will list all of the hazards that affect the jurisdictions covered in the plan. At a minimum, the plan will address flood, coastal hazards if applicable, winter storms, tornado, and wind. The plan will show where the hazards occur, provide a history of past occurrences, and estimate the probability of future occurrences. GIS hazard layers accompany the plan and may be obtained from the county or MEMA. While all local hazard mitigation plans in Maryland must address flood, coastal hazards, winter storm, tornadoes, and wind hazards, the plans are not limited to only addressing those hazards. Many plans also address other hazards that occur within their localities, some of which may pose a threat to cultural resources. These are the hazards identified in the Allegheny County Hazard Mitigation Plan, along with their risk potential. Note that the county identifies both land subsidence and wildfire as two potential natural hazards that have a medium to medium-high likelihood of occurrence. The local hazard mitigation plan will identify what hazards may affect the jurisdiction and rank the probability of hazard occurrence, and also will depict what areas in the jurisdiction are likely to be impacted by those hazards. The local hazard mitigation plan will identify where hazards occur. The location should be available electronically in a format compatible with GIS software. Once you've identified which hazards will affect cultural resources, the next step is to determine where these hazards will occur and to determine if there are cultural resources located within those hazard areas. Now that you know where the hazards will occur, you need to determine if there are cultural resources in those hazard areas. This slide provides a list of places that are repositories for information on cultural resources. The Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties is available as a GIS layer. However, local inventories may be more up to date as the MIHP relies on its local partners to provide updates to the state's inventory. The advantage to having the information on the location of cultural resources as a GIS layer is that it can be imported into other GIS applications like HAZUS. HAZUS is a program used by emergency managers that provides a standardized methodology for estimating the potential impact on populations and the economic losses from earthquakes, hurricanes, and floods. The loss estimates provide a basis for developing mitigation plans and policies, and for emergency preparedness, response, and recovery planning. Historic properties can be brought into HAZUS as a user-defined facility and then run with the flood scenario to understand how flooding will impact these properties. MEMA has completed all of the HAZUS runs for coastal flooding and will be looking to do the same for riverine flooding beginning in 2017. If you're using MarylandFloodMaps.net, you can import the shapefiles with the location of historic resources into the software to see where they fall in the floodplain. Or you can see the location of properties listed in the Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties, the National Register of Historic Places, and properties for which MHT holds the preservation easement. On MDFloodMaps.net, you can see if these properties fall within the floodplain or are vulnerable to the effects of sea level rise or storm surge. The three maps depicted in this slide show where historic properties occur in relation to these hazards. Predicted Category 1 through 5 storm surge on the left, 0 to 2 feet of sea level rise, 2 to 5 feet of sea level rise in the center, the 100-year floodplain, which is the regulatory floodplain, and the 500-year floodplain to the right. Inventories only list properties that have been surveyed and evaluated to understand their importance in local, state, or national history. But there are many historic properties throughout the state that have not been formally identified or studied. MHT's Office of Research, Survey, and Registration estimates that only 14% of the buildings in Maryland constructed before 1960 have been surveyed and evaluated. That's only about 42,000 out of nearly 600,000 properties. So when you're looking at conducting a risk assessment, you should include survey activities to identify and evaluate any previous unrecorded historic properties that are within the high hazard areas. MHT is not just a source for data, we're also a resource. Survey work should be a collaborative process between MHT and the local government. We can provide technical assistance to help develop a scope of work for the survey and share lessons learned for how other jurisdictions have successfully and inexpensively completed similar survey work. As you start thinking about how you will approach conducting survey, you should consider these questions. Are there places in the hazard areas that have not had cultural resources survey? Do those areas contain or are they likely to contain undocumented cultural resources? If the answer to both of these questions is yes, those areas are good candidates for conducting a hazard mitigation cultural resources survey. Conducting a gap analysis will help to quantify if and how many undocumented resources are in your area. SDOT is the State Database of Assessment and Taxation. It's a database by county with all the buildings in a county with attributes such as address, date of construction, number of floors, number of bathrooms, land value, and building value. The SSTAT data is available for free through download through the Maryland Department of Planning's website through the address on this slide. By sorting each set of information by address and year built, that will return matches between the MIHP and the SSTAT information. Those are the properties that have been surveyed. Properties that have not been surveyed will not appear in the MIHP. Of those properties, you should be looking for the buildings constructed in 1966 or earlier. When the City of Annapolis began the process of analyzing the information they had on their historic resources in their study area, they found that of the 180 historic properties in the study area, only 28 had complete Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties forms. 61 properties potentially eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places only had a basic 2-page, 1-photo, 1-map reconnaissance survey form, and 91 properties had no documentation at all. Through the Maryland Historical Trust Certified Local Government Program, the city received a grant to conduct architectural and historical investigations and complete Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties forms for 50 of the 61 properties in the study area that may be vulnerable to flooding. All work was conducted in accordance with MHT's standard and guidelines for architectural and historical investigations in Maryland. Once you've figured out which areas to survey, this is a good point at which to seek technical assistance from MHT's Office of Research, Survey, and Registration on how to develop your scope of work. Hazard Mitigation Survey for Cultural Resources is a balancing act between gathering data on cultural resources and gathering data to assess the risk natural hazards pose to those resources. Because there is no direct funding mechanism for architectural and historic investigation, surveys conducted as part of risk assessments might be the only time that some of the vulnerable historic resources are recorded. For this reason, it is important to consider going beyond the scope of a typical risk assessment by conducting abbreviated survey district documentation. This is a new type of survey to be used when conducting hazard mitigation planning activities for historic properties. Using a single Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties form, the preparer can look at the hazard area as a cohesive whole with a shared history. Survey district documentation includes identifications of the boundaries of the study area, a list of properties that are included within the boundary by address and resource status, a description of the overall setting and architectural descriptions for representative examples of the resources, as well as a developed historic context. The architectural survey forms for hazard mitigation planning will accompany the survey district documentation for inclusion in the Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties. Survey district documentation can provide the beginning framework for a future National Register Historic District nomination and identify resources that may be eligible for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places. While the State Historic Preservation Officer must concur on formal eligibility, this information can be used when developing hazard mitigation priorities and as part of the historic preservation review process for federal or state undertakings. However, it should be noted that the survey district approach only works when there is a cohesive study area and not isolated pockets of unrelated resources. When developing the scope of work, you should include discussion on the boundaries of the survey area, what historic resources you will survey, your survey and risk assessment methods, and who will conduct the work. Depending on the size of the hazard area and the number of historic resources, you may realize that due to time, budgetary, or personnel constraints, that you are not able to conduct a survey and risk assessment for all of the historic resources in the hazard area during your initial effort. There are many ways to refine your hazard area by prioritizing which areas or historic resources you will survey and assess. This is a good place to engage the public about the Historic Resources Hazard Mitigation Survey and Risk Assessment Project and to garner input as to what the public's priorities are for which areas and which resources you will survey and assess. For example, will you look at the historic structures only in the 100-year floodplain or both the 100-year and 500-year floodplain? You could consider breaking down your survey by watershed. This should involve prioritizing watersheds, which is a conversation to have with your local floodplain manager, as he or she will be aware of how the watersheds are prioritized in terms of risk to the county or jurisdiction. A project to consider might be conducting a joint survey and risk assessment with other counties or jurisdictions that share the watershed who also have historic resources at risk to flooding. Another potential way to refine your study area could be based on the type of historic resources. Do you want to focus on properties listed in or eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places, or every building constructed in or before 1966? Perhaps only buildings within a specific period of time, or only buildings in historic districts. You could also focus on areas that have never had an architectural or historical investigation, such as rural areas or underserved communities. You could also focus on types of historic resources that have never had an architectural or historical investigation, like mid-century modern buildings, vernacular buildings, or perhaps tobacco barns. You should also consider whether or not to include artifact repositories, such as museums or archives, historic objects, and cultural landscapes in your assessment. Another thing to consider is the level of effort. Will you be developing a historic context for your survey area to provide additional information on any undocumented buildings? Will you be completing a Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties form to define and record new historic resources that you may have identified? Will you be completing National Register of Historic Places nomination forms or revising existing forms? Will you be making determinations of eligibility? Also, what are the anticipated recommendations for the work? Possible recommendations are to identify future areas for hazard mitigation cultural resources survey, to conduct architectural and historical investigation on flood-prone properties and complete MIHP forms or National Register forms, and to identify flood mitigation projects for historic properties. Finally, who will conduct the survey or risk assessment? Because cultural resources and understanding historic structures and hazard mitigation are two distinct fields with specific skill sets, the survey should be completed by a team. Although if there's one person that meets both requirements, that's fine too. The team should have at least one person who meets the Secretary of the Interior's professional qualification standards for conducting architectural and historic investigations, and someone with hazard mitigation or emergency management planning experience. For risk assessments of flood hazards, it is useful to have a certified floodplain manager on the team or someone knowledgeable about floodplain regulations. It is also useful to have a licensed surveyor on the team to shoot first floor elevations, lowest adjacent grade, and other data points relevant to flood mitigation. This information will be used when you develop mitigation actions for protecting buildings against flooding. Your scope of work should also address how the results of the survey and risk assessment will be incorporated into local and state planning efforts, and how the results will be communicated to the public, to preservation stakeholders, and to the Maryland Historical Trust. Hazard mitigation goals shouldn't only be in the local hazard mitigation plan, they should also be coordinated and incorporated in your local comprehensive plan, and if you have one, in your preservation plan, as well as aligned with potential upcoming projects that will be undertaken as part of the actions recommended in those plans. To gather more detailed information about specific historic properties that will help you when you're developing hazard mitigation projects, MHT has developed the Architectural Survey Form for Hazard Mitigation Planning. The form can be used to record information on undocumented historic resources and on properties listed in the Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties or the National Register of Historic Places. The form contains fields that address the physical characteristics of the structure, the type of flooding, and the grounds surrounding the building, as well as information on the property's location, use, and value, and whether or not it has been part of a previous investigation. This information will be used to assess the vulnerability of the building to damage by flooding, estimate the replacement cost for the building, and determine appropriate flood mitigation actions and recommendations for further architectural and historical investigation. The form can be completed in conjunction with an abbreviated survey district documentation. However, this form is not a substitute for the Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties form, the determination of eligibility documentation, nor for the National Register of Historic Places form. After you've completed your survey of historic structures in hazard-prone areas, the next step is to examine the information you've gathered to determine each property's vulnerability. For example, among the historic structures vulnerable to floods, Some will have greater risk of flood damage than others because of their condition, their foundation type, the distance from flood hazard, ground conditions, and other factors such as importance to the community. By analyzing this information, you can sort the structures into high, medium, and low vulnerability. FEMA has developed worksheets to help analyze risks to historic properties. They can be found in Integrating Historic Property and Cultural Resource Considerations in Hazard Mitigation Planning, which is Volume 6, and the State and Local Mitigation Planning How-To Guides. The FEMA Guide will also walk you through conducting a risk assessment. The worksheet depicted on this slide was designed to help organize the information collected on historic properties and cultural resources during the mapping and survey portions of the risk assessment, and it can be used to help establish preservation priorities, which is the next step in the hazard mitigation planning process. You'll notice that the worksheet has a column for level of property vulnerability. Regardless of whether or not you use this form, you will still need to determine a level of vulnerability. Knowing how vulnerable a property is to being damaged by a hazard is necessary for developing preservation priorities, mitigation goals, and mitigation actions. Estimating the economic losses associated with the potential damage by a hazard is an important part of the risk assessment. Economic losses can be calculated in HAZUS for flood, hurricane, and earthquake hazards, or can be estimated using a formula based on the fair market value or the assessed value of the structure. This can be challenging for historic properties because they are unique in terms of their materials, craftsmanship, and the intangible value to the community. A separate training module will discuss methods for estimating the economic loss for historic properties. This is where you pull together all of the information from the risk analysis into a narrative describing the potential impact of the hazard on your resources and the vulnerability of those resources to the hazard. For example, a vulnerability description could include information like 3,247 buildings have the potential of being damaged due to storm surge flooding. The building count includes these critical and public facilities: 4 government facilities, 8 schools, and 6 fire stations. The sum of the estimated damages for all critical and public facilities within the storm surge area was $1.1 million. However, the majority of buildings affected by flooding are single-family residences, which comprise approximately 88.8% of the buildings affected. Maps accompany the vulnerability description and are used to illustrate the spatial extent and distribution of the hazard-affected areas. All of this information is incorporated into the local hazard mitigation plan, and the information becomes the basis for determining mitigation priorities and actions. After the completion of the risk assessment is a good time to communicate the risk to the community and communicate ways to reduce that risk that balance preservation and protection. It's also a good time to bring in experts from your planning team and state partners such as the Maryland Historical Trust, the Maryland Department of the Environment, and the Maryland Emergency Management Agency. Historic property owners in the 100-year floodplain could be the target audience to communicate information about purchasing flood insurance, the steps that historic property owners can take to reduce the impact of storms on their properties, and to discuss appropriate mitigation actions that, as we've mentioned, balance preservation and flood protection. It is also important to send your results to the Maryland Historical Trust. MHT's inventory only includes information on recorded historic properties, so if you've conducted hazard mitigation survey and risk assessment on previously unrecorded sites, we would like to know where those properties are located and what they are. Even though the information captured in the architectural survey forms for hazard mitigation planning will not be included in the Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties, having this information on file will help us to guide architectural and historical investigations or provide direction for future research. Obviously, the information and accompanying report from conducting abbreviated survey district documentation must be sent to MHT. If the abbreviated survey district documentation meets MHT's standards and guidelines for architectural and historical investigations in Maryland, then it will be included in the Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties. Thanks for listening to Risk Assessment for Cultural Resources, Module 3 of MHT's presentations on integrating cultural resources into hazard mitigation planning. Future modules will address estimating the costs of flood damages to historic properties, prioritizing cultural resources to determine mitigation actions, and how to write and implement the cultural resources portion of your local hazard mitigation plan.